We've been taught that being a good person means never feeling anger, never experiencing jealousy, never harboring dark thoughts about those we love. Society rewards the smile that hides resentment, the politeness that masks rage, the composure that suppresses desire. We're trained from childhood to bury what's deemed unacceptable, to present only the sanitized version of ourselves to the world. And the consequence? A life spent performing goodness while an entire universe of forbidden feelings festers beneath the surface, growing stronger in the darkness. But what if the very act of repression is what creates our suffering? Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, spent decades exploring the human psyche and arrived at a radical conclusion. The impulses we desperately try to deny don't disappear. They go underground, where they gain power, distort our behavior, and eventually erupt in ways we can't control. He discovered that our repressed desires, our forbidden thoughts, our shameful urges are not signs of moral failure, but fundamental aspects of human nature demanding recognition. Freud observed that the patients who experienced genuine liberation weren't those who successfully buried their impulses deeper, but those who developed the courage to face them directly. Those who learned to acknowledge the rage toward a parent, the sexual feelings society condemned, the aggressive thoughts that violated their self-image, these were the ones who found freedom from their symptoms. The transformation didn't come from becoming better people, but from becoming honest about who they actually were. In this video, we'll explore Freud's revolutionary framework for confronting what you've spent a lifetime avoiding. You'll discover why your repressed impulses are currently controlling you more than you realize, how to safely bring them into conscious awareness without being overwhelmed, and the specific process Freud developed for integrating these shadow aspects into a more authentic, less conflicted existence. This isn't about indulging every dark impulse. It's about understanding the mechanism of repression and why facing what you've hidden is the only path to genuine psychological freedom. If you're new to the channel and haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and like this video to support our work. Thank you for your support. Now, let's begin by understanding the invisible prison that repression creates. Imagine a house where certain rooms are locked and forbidden. No one speaks of what's behind those doors. Visitors are never allowed near them. Over time, the family forgets what's even stored there, but they feel the weight of those locked spaces in every interaction, in the way they move through the remaining rooms, in the unspoken rules that govern their lives. Freud recognized that the human psyche operates exactly like this house, with entire regions of our inner world sealed off from consciousness, their contents exerting invisible influence on everything we think, feel, and do. The truth Freud uncovered wasn't comfortable. Civilization itself depends on repression. To function in society, children must learn to deny their most basic impulses, the desire to possess the parent completely, the rage when needs aren't immediately met, the sexual curiosity that emerges long before it's socially acceptable. This repression isn't optional. It's the price of admission to the social world. But here's what Freud observed that others missed. The psyche doesn't actually eliminate these impulses. It merely relocates them. Consider the devoted daughter who visits her aging mother weekly, always patient, always kind, never expressing frustration. On the surface, she embodies filial virtue, but Freud would notice the migraine that appears before each visit, the accidental, forgotten appointments, the dreams where the mother appears as a demanding tyrant. The repressed resentment hasn't disappeared. It's found other channels, other languages, other ways to make itself known. The daughter genuinely doesn't feel conscious anger toward her mother, which is precisely why the anger controls her life. Or take the man who prides himself on his faithfulness, who would never consciously consider infidelity. Yet he finds himself repeatedly in situations where attractive colleagues seek his advice, where business trips create opportunities for innocent dinners, where the boundaries between professional and personal somehow blur. Freud understood that the repressed sexual impulse doesn't vanish. It orchestrates scenarios where accidental encounters seem to just happen. The man's conscious morality is impeccable, which is why he remains blind to how his unconscious is arranging his life. According to Freud, human nature is fundamentally driven by forces that civilization requires us to renounce. The infant's pleasure principle, the demand for immediate satisfaction, must yield to the reality principle, to delayed gratification, to societal norms. But the pleasure principle doesn't actually yield. It goes underground. The libidinal energy, the aggressive drives, the polymorphous perversity of childhood sexuality, all of this gets pushed into the unconscious, where it continues to seek expression through symptoms, through dreams, through slips of the tongue. In his clinical work, Freud made a crucial observation. The patients suffering most intensely weren't those with the worst impulses, but those with the strongest repression. The woman with debilitating anxiety attacks had no conscious awareness of her rage toward her husband. The man with obsessive hand-washing rituals had completely dissociated from his childhood sexual curiosity. The intensity of the symptom was directly proportional to the energy required to keep the impulse unconscious. Every panic attack, every compulsion, every inexplicable phobia was the psyche's distorted attempt to process what consciousness refused to acknowledge. What distinguished those who found relief in psychoanalysis wasn't their moral superiority or their intelligence. It was their willingness to suspend judgment long enough to let the repressed material surface. The breakthrough moments came when a patient could finally say, "Yes, I do hate my father," or "Yes, I do have sexual feelings that terrify me," or "Yes, I do wish my sibling had never been born." Not to act on these feelings, but simply to acknowledge their existence without immediately burying them again in shame. The illusion most people maintain is that they're making progress by developing better control, stronger willpower, more sophisticated ways to manage their unacceptable impulses. They meditate to suppress their anger, they pray to eliminate their lust, they perform acts of service to compensate for their selfishness. But Freud recognized this as building higher walls around the locked rooms, making the house of the psyche even more cramped, even more governed by what cannot be acknowledged. The repressed doesn't stay quietly locked away. It demands expression with increasing urgency. Freud's radical proposition was that genuine psychological health requires a different relationship with these impulses entirely. Not indulgence, not suppression, but conscious awareness. The goal of psychoanalysis wasn't to make people good in the conventional sense. It was to make them conscious, to transform what operates in darkness into something that can be seen, understood, and integrated. Because only what is conscious can be genuinely chosen or refused. What remains unconscious simply happens to us, controlling our lives while we maintain the illusion of being in control. If you identified with this struggle between who you present yourself to be and the impulses you've buried, click the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for your support. The question now becomes, how do we actually access what's been so carefully hidden from ourselves? This brings us to perhaps Freud's most important insight, that the unconscious is constantly revealing itself, constantly seeking expression, constantly offering clues to what we've repressed. The psyche doesn't want to remain divided. The symptoms that plague us, the dreams that disturb us, the slips that embarrass us, these aren't random glitches but meaningful communications from the parts of ourselves we've disowned. Learning to read these communications is the beginning of the journey toward facing what we've spent our lives avoiding. The popular misunderstanding of Freudian psychoanalysis is that it's about dredging up traumatic memories or indulging in endless self-analysis. People imagine lying on a couch for years, wallowing in childhood grievances, blaming parents for adult failures. This caricature misses the revolutionary nature of what Freud actually developed, a systematic method for making the unconscious conscious, for bringing into awareness what has been operating in the shadows, for transforming blind compulsion into conscious choice. Freud called this fundamental therapeutic process making the unconscious conscious, but the concept he's most known for in relation to repressed impulses is the mechanism of the return of the repressed. He observed that what we push out of awareness doesn't disappear. It returns in disguised forms. The repressed impulse is like water pressing against a dam. It will find cracks, weak points, alternative routes. Understanding this mechanism is crucial because it reveals why trying harder to suppress your impulses is futile and why a completely different approach is necessary. Sigmund Freud began his career as a neurologist in Vienna, trained in the scientific method, committed to understanding the physical basis of nervous disorders. But in the 1880s and 90s, he encountered patients, mostly women diagnosed with hysteria, whose symptoms had no organic cause. Paralysis with no nerve damage, blindness with no eye disease, pain with no physical injury. The medical establishment dismissed these patients as malingerers or mystery cases beyond treatment. But Freud made a different choice. Instead of dismissing these patients, he listened to them. He collaborated with Joseph Breuer, learning hypnosis and the talking cure. He traveled to Paris to study with Jean-Martin Charcot, observing how psychological factors could produce physical symptoms. And then, in the 1890s, he embarked on what he would later call the most important work of my life, the systematic self-analysis of his own psyche. For several years, Freud engaged in a process most would consider unbearable. Every night, he recorded and analyzed his own dreams. He examined his own slips of tongue, his own forgettings, his own inexplicable emotions. He traced his own childhood memories, not with nostalgia but with unflinching honesty about what he actually felt, including feelings toward his parents that violated every social norm. This wasn't a romantic journey of self-discovery, it was archaeological work in the ruins of his own psyche. The process was isolating. Freud couldn't share what he was uncovering with most of his colleagues. The content was too shocking, the method too unorthodox. He faced his own dreams of his mother's death, his own competitive rage toward his father, his own sexual impulses that consciousness had carefully edited. There were no guidebooks for this journey, no previous maps of the unconscious territory he was exploring. He was both the experimenter and the subject, both the analyst and the analysand. What emerged from this self-analysis wasn't pleasant insight or spiritual enlightenment. Freud confronted the reality that beneath his civilized exterior existed the same primitive drives that governed all humans. The Oedipus complex, the death drive, the polymorphous perversity of infantile sexuality. He discovered that his conscious self-image as a rational scientist was a thin veneer over a cauldron of unconscious impulses, conflicts, and desires. The respectable Viennese doctor contained within him the same primal forces that drove his patients to their symptoms. This confrontation is key to understanding Freud's method. He wasn't theorizing from a position of superiority about the sick minds of others. He was reporting from the front lines of his own psyche. The mechanisms he identified, repression, projection, displacement, reaction formation, weren't abstract concepts, but patterns he first recognized in himself. The unconscious wasn't a theoretical construct, but a reality he encountered directly in his own mental life. Freud realized that consciousness is not the master of the psyche, but rather a small, vulnerable structure built on top of vast, unconscious foundations. The ego, our sense of I, is constantly negotiating between three forces: the id, the reservoir of unconscious impulses; the superego, the internalized voice of authority and prohibition; and external reality. Most people identify completely with the ego's perspective, believing their conscious thoughts and decisions represent their whole self. But Freud's insight was that the ego is more like a rider on a horse, the ida, who likes to believe he's directing the horse's movement, when in reality the horse often goes where it wants, and the rider just rationalizes the direction after the fact. The repressed impulses in the ID don't respect the ego's conscious intentions. They pursue their own aims through whatever means available. For psychoanalysis to be effective, the ego must become strong enough to face what it has been fleeing, to acknowledge what it has been denying, to integrate what it has been splitting off. This requires a specific kind of honesty that most people never develop. Not the honesty of confessing your conscious failings or admitting your known flaws. That's easy compared to confronting the impulses you genuinely don't believe you have. It demands the willingness to consider that your conscious experience of yourself might be a carefully constructed defense against recognizing who you actually are beneath the defenses. The method Freud developed wasn't comfortable. It couldn't be done alone because the ego's defenses are too skilled at protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. It required another person, the analyst, who could recognize the patterns the patient couldn't see, who could interpret the dreams the patient couldn't understand, who could point out the resistance that arose whenever certain topics approached consciousness. The analyst's role wasn't to judge or advise, but to provide a space where the unconscious could safely reveal itself. But here's what makes this process genuinely transformative rather than merely therapeutic. Freud wasn't trying to eliminate the repressed impulses or make people normal according to society's standards. He was trying to expand consciousness, to bring more of the psyche into awareness, to transform unconscious compulsion into conscious conflict. The goal wasn't to become a better adjusted automaton. It was to become aware of the forces actually driving your life, so you could make genuine choices rather than being unconsciously controlled. Now we arrive at the practical question: how does one actually engage in this process? What are the concrete steps for facing repressed impulses rather than continuing to be controlled by them? Facing your repressed impulses isn't a single dramatic confrontation, but a sustained practice of psychological archaeology, carefully, methodically excavating layers of defense to reach the material buried beneath. Freud didn't offer quick fixes or simple techniques because he understood that the psyche's defenses exist for a reason and must be approached with respect for their protective function. Yet he did develop a structured approach, a series of practices that, pursued consistently, create the conditions for the unconscious to reveal itself. What makes this challenging is that your conscious mind will actively resist the very process that could free you. The ego doesn't want to know what it has repressed. That's why it repressed it in the first place. You'll need a framework that accounts for this resistance, that expects it, that works with it rather than being defeated by it. Freud's method provides exactly this. The foundation consists of 4 essential practices, each addressing a different aspect of how repression operates and how it can be gradually dissolved. Free association, suspending the censor. The primary technique Freud developed was deceptively simple. Say everything that comes to mind without censoring it. In psychoanalytic sessions, this meant lying on the couch, not looking at the analyst, and speaking every thought, feeling, image, or sensation that arose, especially the ones that seemed irrelevant, embarrassing, or nonsensical. The rule was total honesty, which meant including the thoughts about the analyst, the resistance to the process, the silly associations that seemed like they couldn't possibly matter. This practice works because the psyche's defenses operate through selection. By choosing what's acceptable to think and speak, you maintain the repression. Free association removes that selection, creating gaps through which unconscious material can slip through. When you say the random thought about your mother that interrupted your discussion of work stress, when you admit the sexual image that appeared during a conversation about something neutral, when you voice the murderous fantasy you'd normally immediately suppress, these are the moments when the repressed begins to surface. Dream analysis, reading the night language. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, because during sleep, the ego's defenses relax and repressed material can emerge, though still in disguised symbolic form, to prevent the dreamer from waking in horror at what they're actually thinking. The practice of recording dreams immediately upon waking, then examining them not for their surface narrative but for their latent content, provides direct access to unconscious processes. What matters isn't the obvious dream story, but the free associations each dream element triggers. The dream of being late to an important exam might superficially seem like anxiety about performance, but when you follow the associations, what exam, which teacher, what age were you, who else was there, you might discover repressed competition with a sibling, or sexual guilt about childhood curiosity, or rage at a parent's impossible standards. The dream work, condensation, displacement, symbolization, reveals the mechanisms the unconscious uses to express what consciousness refuses to acknowledge. Transference analysis, recognizing projected patterns. One of Freud's most crucial discoveries was that patients inevitably begin to experience toward the analyst the same feelings, conflicts, and patterns they have with significant figures in their lives, especially parents. This transference isn't a problem to be avoided, but the most valuable material to be analyzed. When you notice yourself having strong emotional reactions to your analyst or therapist, or in self-analysis to authority figures generally, unreasonable anger, inappropriate attraction, excessive need for approval, rebellious resistance, these reactions are revealing repressed patterns. The practice is to observe these reactions without acting on them, to bring them into consciousness and explore them. Why do you need this person's approval so desperately? Why does their perceived criticism devastate you? Why do you feel competitive rather than collaborative? These patterns reveal the unconscious templates you're still operating from, the childhood dynamics you're still enacting, symptom investigation, following the substitute satisfactions. Every psychological symptom, every phobia, every compulsion, every inexplicable anxiety, every physical manifestation without organic cause represents a compromise formation. It's the psyche's attempt to satisfy a repressed impulse while still keeping it repressed. The practice is to examine your symptoms not as problems to eliminate but as communications to decode. The compulsive hand-washing might be defending against unconscious aggressive or sexual impulses associated with the hands. The fear of public speaking might represent repressed exhibitionism combined with fear of the father's judgment. The chronic headaches might be the somatic expression of rage you can't consciously feel. Instead of trying to make the symptom go away, you investigate what unconscious purpose it serves, what impulse it's simultaneously expressing and concealing. These 4 practices work together to create multiple entry points into the unconscious. You're not relying on willpower to force confrontation with repressed material that would only strengthen the defenses. Instead, you're creating conditions where the unconscious can reveal itself through the cracks in your defenses, through the symbolic languages of dreams and symptoms, through the patterns that repeat in your relationships. Freud himself employed these methods throughout his life. After his formal self-analysis, he continued the practice of dream interpretation, maintained his own analysis of his reactions and resistances, and used his understanding of psychoanalytic principles to remain aware of his own unconscious processes. He didn't claim to have fully analyzed himself. He recognized that complete self-knowledge is impossible, that there will always be blind spots, that new layers of repressed material can emerge throughout life. The requirement for this work is radical honesty. Not the honesty of confessing what you already know about yourself, but the willingness to discover what you don't want to know. It requires tolerating uncertainty, sitting with discomfort, allowing shameful or frightening material into awareness without immediately defending against it. Most people can't sustain this alone, which is why Freud insisted on the necessity of the analyst-patient relationship for genuine psychoanalytic work. But even without formal analysis, understanding these principles changes your relationship with your own psyche. You begin to recognize when you're rationalizing rather than reasoning, when you're avoiding rather than addressing, when your strong reaction to something reveals an unconscious conflict. You start to read your own dreams, to notice your own slips, to question your own certainties about your motivations and feelings. The confrontation this prepares you for isn't a single moment of dramatic revelation. It's the ongoing experience of meeting aspects of yourself you've denied. And this confrontation, as we're about to explore, is where the real difficulty begins. The moment arrives not with fanfare, but in silence. You're engaged in free association, or you've just woken from a particularly vivid dream, or you're in the middle of describing a trivial memory when suddenly something shifts. The carefully constructed narrative you've told yourself about who you are, what you feel, what you want, it cracks. And through that crack seeps something you've spent decades ensuring would never reach consciousness. The true test of facing repressed impulses isn't the intellectual understanding that you have an unconscious or the theoretical acceptance that civilization requires repression. The test comes when you first consciously recognize an impulse in yourself that violates your entire self-concept, when you feel the genuine rage towards someone you're supposed to love, when you acknowledge the sexual desire you're supposed to never have, when you admit the satisfaction you took in someone else's suffering. In that moment, every defense mechanism in your psyche mobilizes to push this awareness back into darkness. The pain that emerges isn't physical, but it's visceral nonetheless, a kind of psychic nausea, a destabilization of your sense of self that feels genuinely dangerous. Because in a very real sense, it is dangerous. The you that has been navigating the world, the ego structure you've built, has been predicated on certain things being definitively not you. I am not the kind of person who feels this. I am not someone who wants that. This impulse belongs to bad people, sick people, not to me. When the repression lifts and you recognize these impulses as authentically yours, the person you believed yourself to be begins to dissolve. Your mind will attempt immediate sabotage of this awareness. Suddenly you'll feel sleepy during your analysis session. You'll forget to record your dreams. You'll find very reasonable justifications for missing appointments. You'll decide that psychoanalysis is probably pseudoscience anyway, that Freud was a cocaine-addicted sexist, that you're feeling much better now and don't need to continue this uncomfortable work. This resistance isn't weakness. It's the ego's defense system doing exactly what it was designed to do, protect you from psychological disintegration. But if you persist, if you continue the practice despite the resistance, something begins to happen. The repressed material that initially felt so threatening becomes slightly more bearable. Not because it changes, but because you develop the capacity to hold it in consciousness without collapsing. The murderous rage toward your mother can coexist with genuine love for her. The sexual fantasies you were taught were perverse can be acknowledged without acting on them. The selfishness and cruelty you discovered in yourself can be recognized as part of human nature, not evidence of your unique monstrosity. Freud observed, "Where it was, their ego shall be." This seemingly simple statement contains his entire therapeutic vision. The Odyssey is the realm of unconscious impulses, operating according to the pleasure principle, demanding immediate satisfaction without regard for reality or morality. The ego is the conscious, rational part of the psyche that must negotiate with reality. The goal isn't to eliminate the ID, that's impossible and would leave you psychically dead, but to expand the territory of the ego, to bring more of what was unconscious under conscious awareness. The function of this confrontation, then, isn't to make the impulses go away, but to transfer them from the realm of blind compulsion to the realm of conscious conflict. When an impulse is unconscious, it controls you. It expresses itself through symptoms, through acting out, through patterns you can't recognize or change. When an impulse is conscious, you have a choice. You can choose to express it in sublimated form, to acknowledge it without acting on it, to understand where it comes from and what need it represents. The insights that emerge from this confrontation are often paradoxical. You discover that the sexual feelings you were terrified of acknowledging are less powerful once you stop fighting them. The aggressive impulses lose some of their charge when you can say, "Yes, I do feel this rage," instead of channeling it into passive-aggressive behavior or somatic symptoms. The death wishes, the incestuous longings, the perverse fantasies. When they're no longer consuming energy to keep them repressed, they often reveal themselves as less monstrous than the defenses against them. You realize that psychological health isn't the absence of dark impulses, but the integration of them. The person who claims to never feel anger, never experience jealousy, never have inappropriate sexual thoughts isn't virtuous. They're deeply repressed, and their repressed impulses are leaking out in ways they can't control. The anxiety they can't explain, the irrational fears, the physical symptoms, the patterns of self-sabotage, these are all the return of what they refuse to acknowledge. What makes the confrontation necessary, not optional, is that the alternative is a life governed by forces you don't understand and can't control. Every unexplained anxiety attack is the repressed impulse trying to surface. Every compulsive ritual is a defense against acknowledging what you really feel. Every relationship pattern you repeat despite consciously wanting something different is driven by unconscious templates you haven't brought into awareness. You can spend your entire life managing symptoms while the root remains untouched. But there's a deeper transformation that begins in this confrontation. As you face what you've repressed, as you integrate aspects of yourself you've denied, you begin to experience a kind of psychic wholeness you've never known. Not because you've become a better person in the moral sense, but because you've become a more complete person. Someone who can acknowledge the full range of human impulse and feeling without fragmenting into acceptable and unacceptable parts. The person who emerges from genuine confrontation with their repressed impulses isn't necessarily happier in the conventional sense, but they're more real. They've traded the prison of unconscious compulsion for the freedom of conscious conflict. They've traded the false peace of repression for the authentic struggle of integration. They've stopped performing who they should be and started inhabiting who they actually are. This transformation, difficult as it is to achieve, changes everything about how you move through the world. And this brings us to what Freud called the analytic process of working through, the slow, repetitive, unglamorous work of actually integrating these insights into your lived experience. The transformation doesn't announce itself with clarity or celebration. For months, perhaps years, you've been doing the work, the free association, the dream analysis, the examination of your symptoms and patterns. You've faced impulses that horrified you, acknowledged feelings you swore you'd never have, recognized yourself in behaviors you'd always condemned in others. And then, almost imperceptibly, something shifts in how you inhabit your own psyche. The moment you step back into the world after genuinely confronting your repressed impulses, you encounter a peculiar irony. The people in your life don't necessarily notice anything different. They still see the same person, still expect the same responses, still relate to you through the same patterns they've always used, but you've fundamentally changed in ways that make those old interactions feel slightly surreal, like you're watching someone play a role you've outgrown. There's a loneliness to this that nobody warns you about. You've done the difficult work of making the unconscious conscious, of facing what you spent decades avoiding. You understand yourself in ways most people never will. But this understanding doesn't translate into the language of ordinary social interaction. You can't explain to your family that you've recognized and integrated your aggressive impulses toward them, that you now feel both genuine love and genuine resentment and no longer need to hide one to preserve the other. They would hear this as hostility, as pathology, as evidence that psychoanalysis made you worse rather than better. What other people find disturbing in someone who's done genuine analytic work isn't their obvious pathology. It's their quiet refusal to participate in the collective repressions that make social life comfortable. They won't pretend to feelings they don't have. They won't perform the expected emotional reactions. They acknowledge desires and impulses that polite society requires everyone to deny. They've stopped being complicit in the shared fiction that we're all civilized beings with our animal nature fully tamed. The qualities that emerge seem like rudeness to those still invested in repression. The woman who's integrated her aggressive impulses no longer apologizes reflexively, no longer softens her statements with hedging language, no longer prioritizes being liked over being honest. The man who's faced his sexuality no longer performs the elaborate dance of plausible deniability, no longer channels his desire into innocent situations that protect him from acknowledging what he wants. They appear more direct, more transparent, somehow more present. And this presence is uncomfortable for people who rely on others remaining as defended as they are. For the wider world, there's an anticlimactic quality to genuine psychological integration. The person doesn't become visibly enlightened or radiantly happy. They don't write best-selling memoirs about their healing journey or become Instagram therapists selling transformation to the masses. They simply become more themselves, less conflicted, less defended, less driven by unconscious compulsion. They might even appear more ordinary because the dramatic symptoms that once marked their suffering have dissolved into conscious conflict they can manage. But to truly understand what's happened, you have to observe how they return to their lives. They go back to the same job, the same family, the same daily routines, but they inhabit these roles differently. The work that once drained them because it represented unconscious obedience to the father's demands becomes just work, something they choose or don't choose based on conscious values. The relationships that were battlefield for unresolved childhood conflicts become simply relationships with actual people, not symbolic figures from the psychic past. Freud believed that the aim of psychoanalysis was remarkably modest, to transform neurotic misery into ordinary human unhappiness. This sounds pessimistic until you understand what he meant. Neurotic misery is suffering we create through our own defenses, through repression, and the symptoms it generates, through the compulsive repetition of unconscious patterns. This suffering is unnecessary and destructive. It doesn't lead anywhere, doesn't serve any purpose, just perpetuates itself in endless loops. Ordinary human unhappiness, by contrast, is the inevitable friction of being a conscious being in a world that doesn't conform to our wishes. It's the genuine grief of loss, the authentic frustration of limitation, the real conflict between different desires. This unhappiness is bearable because it's connected to reality rather than to unconscious phantoms. You can grieve a death. You can't resolve an unconscious death wish towards someone still living that you refuse to acknowledge you have. The person who's done analytic work doesn't transcend the human condition. They just stop adding layers of neurotic suffering to its inherent difficulties. They don't need to prove anything because they've stopped defending against knowing who they are. They don't need external validation because they're no longer hiding from themselves. They don't need to control others' perceptions because they can tolerate their own reality. What's remarkable is the quiet authority this produces. Not the authority of the guru or the expert, but the authority of someone who knows their own psyche's landscape, who's familiar with their own unconscious processes, who isn't surprised by their own capacity for both love and hate, creation and destruction, nobility and baseness. They've met themselves in the depths and survived the meeting. This changes relationships in subtle but profound ways. They can love without needing to idealize. They can be close without becoming enmeshed. They can set boundaries without guilt because they recognize that their own impulses require management and others do too. They can tolerate conflict because they've learned that aggression doesn't destroy love, that ambivalence is the normal state of human attachment, that relationships can survive the acknowledgement of negative feelings. The transformation manifests most clearly in what doesn't happen anymore. The panic attacks that plagued them for years simply stop because the repressed impulse generating the anxiety has been brought to consciousness and integrated. The compulsive behaviors fade because they're no longer needed as defenses against unconscious wishes. The physical symptoms, the mysterious pains, the chronic fatigue, the psychosomatic illnesses often resolve because the body is no longer being recruited to express what the mind refuses to acknowledge. But here's what Freud understood that many miss. This isn't a permanent state of enlightenment. The unconscious doesn't stop producing impulses that challenge consciousness. New repressions form. Old patterns can resurface under stress. The analytic work isn't a one-time fix, but an ongoing practice of making the unconscious conscious, of expanding the ego's territory, of choosing conscious conflict over unconscious compulsion. The person who's been through analysis doesn't graduate into perfection. They've just learned a method for working with their own psyche that they can continue to employ throughout life. The effect on the collective, while subtle, is significant. One person who stops participating in the shared repressions creates space for others to question theirs. One person who can acknowledge ambivalence gives others permission to admit their own conflicted feelings. One person who's faced their shadow makes it slightly easier for others to face theirs. The transformation is contagious, though not in the way that most therapeutic movements promise. This brings us to the essential question: what does it actually mean to live with this integration? What does daily life look like when you're no longer unconsciously controlled by repressed impulses, but consciously navigating the conflicts inherent in being human? Facing your repressed impulses, in Freud's framework, is an act of radical courage disguised as clinical procedure. It's presented in the language of therapy, diagnosis, and treatment, but what's actually being asked of you is nothing less than psychological heroism, the willingness to encounter aspects of yourself that your entire psychic structure was built to avoid. Most people never undertake this journey, not because they're weak, but because they're smart enough to recognize how much safety they'd have to surrender. The process is alchemical rather than mechanical. You're not fixing broken parts or removing defects. You're transforming the base metal of unconscious compulsion into the gold of conscious awareness. You're taking impulses that controlled you through their invisibility and making them visible, thereby transferring them from the realm of fate to the realm of choice. This transformation doesn't make the impulses disappear. It changes your relationship to them fundamentally. Freud's deepest understanding was that freedom doesn't come from being free of dark impulses, but from being conscious of them. The person who believes they have no aggressive drives is controlled by their aggression in ways they can't recognize. The person who denies their sexual nature is shaped by their sexuality more completely than the person who acknowledges it. The person who represses their death wishes toward loved ones is more dangerous to those loved ones than the person who can consciously recognize and not act on such wishes. True psychological freedom, then, is the freedom that comes from self-knowledge. It's the capacity to say, I know what I'm capable of feeling. I know the full range of my impulses, including the ones that violate my conscious values. And knowing this, I can make conscious choices about what I act on and what I simply acknowledge and integrate. This is maturity in Freud's sense, not the elimination of childish impulses, but their subordination to conscious adult judgment. The person who achieves this integration doesn't become unrecognizable, but certain qualities emerge that distinguish them. They have a groundedness that comes from knowing their own depths. They have a tolerance for complexity and ambivalence that makes them easier to be around paradoxically, even as their honesty makes others uncomfortable. They don't need to project their shadow onto others because they've acknowledged it in themselves. They don't need to control others because they've stopped being controlled by their own unconscious. Their presence has a quality that's hard to define but unmistakable. They're simply more there, more present, more real. They're not performing a role or managing an image. They're not hiding from themselves or from you. They've developed what Freud called ego strength, not arrogance or narcissism, but the capacity to face reality, both external and internal, without collapsing into defense mechanisms. Perhaps most remarkably, they've made peace with being human. They don't expect themselves to transcend their animal nature or achieve some state of perpetual enlightenment. They recognize that being human means having impulses that civilization requires us to renounce, and that the path to genuine psychological health isn't perfect renunciation, but conscious management. They've traded the exhausting performance of being good for the sustainable practice of being aware. This isn't the end of the journey, but its true beginning. Because once you've faced what you've repressed, once you've integrated what you've denied, once you've expanded your consciousness to include your shadow, then you're actually free to live. Not free from conflict, but free within it. Not free from impulses, but free to choose your relationship to them. Not free from being human, but free to be fully, consciously, authentically human. What impulse have you spent your life ensuring would never reach conscious awareness? What feeling towards someone you love have you buried so deeply that you've convinced yourself it doesn't exist? And what price are you paying, in symptoms, in patterns, in unconscious repetitions, for keeping this material repressed? Freud would say that these questions aren't merely psychological curiosities, but existential necessities. He believed that every person carries within them a shadow self, composed of everything consciousness has rejected, and that this shadow doesn't quietly disappear, but actively shapes your life through the mechanisms of return, through symptoms, through dreams, through the patterns you can't seem to break. The question isn't whether your repressed impulses are controlling you, but whether you're willing to face them consciously rather than being unconsciously controlled. If this video revealed something about your own psyche that you've been avoiding, or if it challenged your understanding of what psychological health actually means, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the human mind through Sigmund Freud's revolutionary insights. Until the next video.